Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on our weekly Hebrew word study. And we are going to hopefully be finishing up the book of First Samuel today. We are in First Samuel chapter 31, and remembering from last week that the Philistines were fighting against um, Saul and his armies, and this is a pivotal chapter as we look at how God works to remove Saul from the picture and make the pathway for David to become king. And so we look at verse 1 of chapter 31, and it says, The Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel fled, and the Philistines slew many of them on Mount Gilboa. And then verse 2, it says that the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, which is somewhat of an interesting um, comment. Normally, in the battles that we've read, there's not a target of going after the king, even though that would seem the obvious thing to do. This is where we see it mentioned. I think there was only one other place that I can remember it being mentioned in the future, and that is King Jehoshaphat when he is in a battle. That there's an episode there where he is targeted. So again, this is you ask the question, why is this pointed out? Obviously, in the whole frame of the narrative, Saul's demise was foretold by the witch of Endor, and he knows that this is going to happen. He knows even before that things were not going to go well, and so that's the real plot here: is seeing how God moves to remove Saul from the story. And so the fact that the Philistines are targeting Saul and his sons here, um, taking care of the rest of the royal family, and could be just a narrative that God was moving them in that direction and for this purpose. So we see that happening here, that Saul's sons actually die in front of him, Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua. And so it's kind of interesting that Saul himself is not harmed at this point. And so the battle became fierce, as we see in verse 3. And here's where it gets a little interesting on the different translations. When I read the Hebrew Jewish Bible, it said that the battle went against him, or they overtook him. The archers overtook him, and that he was in anguish because of the archers. That's how the Hebrew Bible reads in its English translation. But here it uses the words that the archers hit him and he was wounded. And so two very, different outlooks here. If we look at the word that's highlighted here as being hit him, we find that it has nothing to do with being hit. It has to do with finding or coming against him. It has a very broad range of meaning. So I can see why the Jewish translators did not assign the word hit. We know that, Saul ultimately dies, but here they're ascribing in the English translation, or Christian translators, put it that way, are saying that he was hit and thought he was going to die. And then even coming down here where it says the archers wounded him severely. Well, this word for wounded really has nothing maybe to do with being wounded. It is the word used for whirling around and dancing. I guess if you are wounded, you might be behaving in such a way. Could be the word writhe, as a person would writhe in pain. So hold that thought, because the Jewish translators again say that he was just oppressed, that he wasn't really injured. And so that sets up what verse 4 is bringing about, in that Saul wanted his armor bearer to kill him. And he says, Thrust me through with your sword, lest these uncircumcised men come, thrust me through and abuse me. So obviously, Saul wasn't near death because of the archers, didn't feel he was going to die because of the archers, wanted to protect himself from the torture that was ultimately to come. Now, something I read interesting, that there were cultures that treated their conquered kings very terribly, and you will see that throughout the Bible. There are places where, their eyes were burned out, they were had their tongue cut out. But what I heard referenced here is that this particular culture, when they caught an opposing king, they would put a hook in his mouth, in through his head, and pull him behind horses through the streets until he died, as a show of defeat. And obviously, that is something that sounds just horrible beyond words to even think of it. And so, this could be a reason why Saul was anxious not to be captured, to have this hook put through his jaw. Obviously, it's going to be painful, and he's going to die from being, um, you know, head injury, neck injury, dragged through the city, just numerous ways you can think of how his life would be ending. And so Saul wanted to avoid that because he knew they would be very cruel to him and torture him. And so he's saying, kill me, to his armor bearer, but his armor bearer wouldn't do it, because he was really afraid. So it says here that Saul went and fell on his sword. So he obviously wanted to kill himself. And now, what's interesting here is there are very few accounts of suicide in the Bible. And so, obviously, Saul thought he was going to live, and he thrust himself through with the sword. And his armor bearer, seeing that Saul did that, also did that himself and killed himself. Now, I want you to hang on to that thought, because when we get to the next chapter, when we get in, 2 Samuel, we're going to find that there's a little bit of a story that changes here about someone who claims that they killed Saul and actually had his crown and had one of his, royal, uh, trinkets or armbands it was. And so, you kind of wonder if maybe the armor bearer killed himself, when he thought Saul was dead, but maybe Saul wasn't dead, or maybe the other story was fabricated. Hang on to this thought for next week when we go and look at that, because here it says that Saul died and his three sons and his armor bearer, and all of them together. So, kind of interesting here, about what really happened. So we get to, we read verse 7, that they saw Saul was dead, the men of Israel, and they fled and forsook cities, and the Philistines came and lived in the city of Saul's sons. Obviously, some time had to take place here. Some time had to pass before they could go and occupy their cities. And we're going to see later on, that it takes time for David to ascend the throne. So, that was a little bit of a future information here. So, verse 8 is somewhat interesting, that they came to strip the Philistines. The next day, they found Saul and his three sons, and it says they cut off their head and stripped off the armor. So notice there's no mention of a crown or any official armbands or other identification of royalty, from Saul. It just says they stripped off his armor, and then they sent the word to the pagan temple of their idols and to the people of the victory, which is a very common thing to do back then. And they put the armor of Saul in Ashtaroth's temple, again as a victory to who they felt their God helped them get the victory. Obviously, they didn't know what was going on behind the scenes, that God, the one true God of Israel, was still completely in control. And then, of course, they fastened as a trophy, his body and those of his sons to this wall in the city called Beth Shean. Again, very, you know, war is horrible. All these things are very horrible, unimaginable to even think of this. But here it is. And so the men of Jabesh Gilead heard what was done. They were loyal to Saul. They arose, some valiant men traveled all night, went to this wall, took down the body of Saul and his sons, and they came to Jabesh. And then something also very interesting is that they burned them there. Um, as we mentioned previously, that um, suicide is not spoken of in the Bible very much. Neither is cremation. In fact, cremation is not a Jewish culture, followed in a Jewish culture at all. They do not cremate bodies. And there are many reasons that you can read about why they don't do that. And so this is one of the few places you see that this occurred. And so very interesting why they burned the bodies. Obviously, there was only or there was enough remnant that the bones were left, and they were able to bury the bones. So, why did they do this? Were the bodies too badly damaged from the battle that ensued? Um, Obviously, they were decapitated. Were they badly decomposed? No one really knows for sure. It just pointed out that cremation is not a Jewish custom in any way. And so that's why it's very strange that it happened here. And then, of course, the men of Jabesh were very mournful. They fasted for 7 days in reference to giving honor to Saul. The other thing that's interesting here is kings were normally buried in very prominent places, and that was a part of the thing of nobility. So it's interesting why they just bury them under a tamarisk tree. Again, this could be just God's way of not wanting to set up a shrine or memorial, having been created for those who are still loyal to Saul. The Bible is very strong on that. But what's interesting here, I'm reading from a Hebrew commentary. It's on the book of Samuel, put out by Socino Press. Now, for us going through and looking at the life of Saul, we are definitely aware of all his shortcomings, all his failures, all of his sins, turning away from God. We do not get a very good impression of Saul. Obviously, God removed him from being king in favor of David coming. And so all those things play in. But I was surprised to see that in the close of this chapter, that the writers, the commentators for this Jewish Bible, speak in much more glowing terms of Saul. And so I'll read it for you so you can think about what they're trying to think here. They say, by the manner of his death, and by contrast, his bright beginning and inglorious ending, Saul wins our complete sympathy. He was a hero of tragedy in the classical sense of the term, a man for whom the world was too much and who was defeated by an inner conflict which he failed to resolve. He had some excellent virtues for the high office to which he was called: courage, generalship, modesty, and generosity. And had he succeeded in an established regime, he might have made a model monarch. Wow. So they speak very, very highly of him, and they don't, really understand things or feel what we feel about why he was removed from being king, because he violated religious protocol and he disobeyed God. So that is completely ignored in this Jewish commentary, which I find quite interesting. So, with that, I'm going to leave you with that profound thought today. Thank you again for sharing in this study. I pray that God's blessing will be upon you, that you will be encouraged to study God's Word, maybe even undertake a little bit of Hebrew, because you can see hopefully how it enlightens and brings these stories to just a greater understanding, and it brings them alive, at least for me, and I hope I'm able to transmit that in some small way. So God bless you, and we'll see you again, Lord so willing, next week. Bye bye.